The Vorthen research station floated silently in the darkness of space, its crystalline towers gleaming under distant starlight. Dr. Chiron was having what she thought would be another boring day of scanning empty frequencies when her equipment suddenly came alive with noise. At first she thought it was just cosmic interference, the kind of random static that filled the void between stars. But as she adjusted her instruments, she realized something incredible was happening. This wasn't random noise. This was a message. Dr. Chiron's crystalline body began to shimmer with excitement as she called her team over. Her fellow researchers gathered around the communication array, their translucent forms reflecting the glow of the screens. They worked together, using their advanced technology to clean up the signal and make sense of what they were hearing. What they discovered made them all freeze in shock. The message was a cry for help. Someone out there was dying, and they were begging the galaxy to save them. The voice speaking was unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was rough and determined, carrying an edge of desperation that cut through the static like a knife. The being identified itself as Commander Jinho, leader of something called the Terran Defense Force. He spoke of his people, who called themselves humans, and how they were facing complete destruction from an enemy known only as the Devourers. But what really shocked Dr. Chiron and her team wasn't just the message itself. It was where the message was coming from. Their instruments clearly showed the signal's origin point. And when they checked their star charts, they couldn't believe what they saw. The transmission was coming from a planet that their databases had marked as completely uninhabitable. This world, which the humans called Earth, was classified as a Class 12 death world. This was the highest danger rating possible, reserved for planets so hostile that even the most basic forms of life shouldn't be able to exist there. These were worlds where gravity could crush bones, where the atmosphere could burn lungs, where massive storms could level entire continents. No intelligent species had ever been known to evolve on such a hellish place, yet here was clear proof that not only had life survived on this nightmare world, but it had become smart enough to build technology and send messages across the stars. Commander Ginho's voice carried an accent that none of them had ever heard before, speaking in patterns that seemed almost musical, despite the urgency of his words. As Dr. Chiron listened to more of the transmission, she learned that these humans had somehow not just survived on their deadly planet, but had thrived there. They had built cities, developed science, and even reached into space. Now, they were facing something that threatened to wipe them out completely. And they were asking for help from anyone who might be listening. The more the research team analyzed the signal, the more amazed they became. The technology behind the transmission was primitive by galactic standards, but it was incredibly efficient. These humans had figured out how to send their message across vast distances using equipment that seemed to be built from basic materials. It was like watching someone create fire using only stones and sticks. Dr. Chiron felt her crystalline heart racing as she realized the implications. If these humans could survive on a world that would kill most galactic species within minutes, what else might they be capable of? What kind of strength and determination would it take to not just live on such a planet, but to build a civilization there? Commander Jinho's voice continued to echo through their speakers, describing an enemy that consumed everything in its path, turning entire worlds into empty husks. The humans were asking for help, but Dr. Chiron wondered if perhaps the galaxy should be asking them for help instead. Dr. Chiron stood nervously in the grand chambers of the Galactic Preservation Council, clutching the datapad that contained humanity's desperate message. The massive room was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all seated in their floating chairs that accommodated their different body types. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert thoughts and words. Between countless alien languages, she had requested this emergency session because she truly believed the human transmission was the most important discovery in galactic history. But as she looked around the room at the bored expressions on alien faces, she realized that convincing them would be much harder than she had hoped. Counselor Vex was the first to speak, his tentacles waving dismissively as he rose from his seat. He was a Morthok, a species known for their logical thinking and complete lack of patience for what they considered nonsense. His voice carried the authority of someone who had been making decisions for the galaxy for over 300 years. "Dr. Chiron," he began, his tone already showing his annoyance. "You're asking us to believe that an intelligent species has evolved on a class-12 death world. You understand how ridiculous that sounds? These planets are literally classified as impossible for complex life. The gravity alone would crush any developing organism before it could even learn to walk." The other council members began murmuring in agreement. Counselor Zeth, whose species had evolved on a peaceful garden world, shook her head in disbelief. "Seen the environmental data from these death worlds," she said. "The temperature swings would boil blood in the day and freeze it solid at night. The atmospheric pressure would collapse any breathing system we know of. It's simply not possible." Dr. Chiron tried to interrupt, holding up her data pad with the recorded transmission. "But we have proof right here." Commander Jinho spoke directly. "To us, his people are real, and they're asking for our help." Counselor Vex laughed, a sound that came out like bubbling water through his translator. "What you have is either a very elaborate hoax or the final hallucinations of some primitive species dying on that toxic rock. Think about it logically. If such a species existed, where are their ships? Where are their colonies? Why haven't we detected them before now?" The council chamber filled with the sounds of agreement from dozens of different species. Dr. Chiron felt her hope beginning to fade as she realized how deep their prejudice ran. These beings had spent thousands of years believing that only species from safe, comfortable worlds could develop intelligence. The idea that something could evolve in hell itself was beyond their understanding. "Even if this transmission is real," continued Counselor Vex, "what could we possibly learn from such primitives? Look at their technology. They're using basic radio waves while we communicate through quantum entanglement. They're probably still using chemical rockets while we fold space itself. If they actually exist, they're so far behind us that helping them would be like teaching mathematics to bacteria." Dr. Chiron made one last desperate attempt. "But what if they're right about the Devourers? What if this enemy they're warning us about is real? Shouldn't we at least investigate?" The council erupted in dismissive laughter. Counselor Yith, whose species had never known war in their entire history, spoke with condescending patience. "Dr. Chiron, the galaxy has been at peace for over 2,000 years. We've evolved beyond primitive concepts like warfare and destruction. These Devourers are obviously just metaphors for natural disasters or perhaps tribal conflicts on there." Hostile world. The vote was swift and unanimous. Every single council member raised their appendage, tentacle, or claw to dismiss the human transmission as unworthy of investigation. They had trade disputes to settle, territorial boundaries too, negotiate and cultural exchanges to plan. They couldn't waste time and resources chasing ghost stories from impossible worlds. As the council session ended and the representatives began filing out, Dr. Chiron remained in her seat, listening to Commander Jinho's voice growing weaker and more distant with each passing moment. Somewhere out there, an entire species was crying out for help, and the galaxy had chosen to look the other way. She wondered if they would live to regret this decision. Captain Thorne was enjoying his morning coffee when the communication blackout began. As the duty officer aboard the Galactic monitoring station, he was used to the constant chatter of signals flowing between the thousands of inhabited worlds across the galaxy. The soft hum of interstellar communications was like background music to his daily routine. But on this particular morning, something was wrong. The signals from Nexus Prime, a thriving colony world on the outer rim, had simply stopped. At first, Captain Thorne wasn't too worried. Technical problems happened all the time. Solar flares could disrupt communications for days. Equipment failed. Sometimes entire planetary networks needed updates that required temporary shutdowns. He filed a routine maintenance request and went back to his coffee. But hours passed, then days, and still nothing from Nexus Prime. The silence was becoming disturbing. This wasn't just a communication problem anymore. 12 billion people didn't just go quiet without a reason. The Galactic Council finally authorized a reconnaissance mission after a full week of silence. Captain Thorne watched the live feed from the drone cameras as they approached the Nexus Prime system, expecting to find damaged communication arrays or perhaps evidence of some natural disaster. What they found instead changed everything where Nexus Prime should have been. There was nothing but empty space and floating debris. The planet itself was gone, not destroyed in some explosive catastrophe, but systematically stripped away until only a barren core remained. The orbital cities that had housed millions of civilians were reduced to twisted metal fragments drifting in space. But the most horrifying part wasn't the destruction itself. It was how precise and methodical it appeared to be. Every piece of organic matter had been consumed. Every useful metal had been harvested. Every drop of water had been extracted. Whatever had done this had taken everything of value and left behind only what it couldn't use. Captain Thorne stared at the footage with growing dread as he remembered something from 3 years ago. Dr. Chiron had played a recording for the Council, a desperate transmission from some unknown species talking about an enemy that consumed everything in its path. The Council had laughed it off as primitive superstition. Nobody was laughing now. Within days of the Nexus Prime discovery, more worlds began going silent. The pattern was always the same. First, communications would stop, then reconnaissance. Drones would find nothing but stripped husks where thriving civilizations had once existed. The enemy moved with terrifying efficiency, consuming everything organic and taking all useful materials before moving on to the next target. The panic started in the Outer Rim colonies, where families began evacuating entire worlds at the first, a sign of approaching ships. But as the attacks continued, the fear spread inward toward the galactic core. These weren't random raids or natural disasters. This was a methodical campaign of consumption that was heading straight for the heart of galactic civilization. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council became daily occurrences. The same representatives who had dismissed the human warning 3 years earlier now found themselves facing exactly what Commander Jinho had tried to warn them about. The Devourers were real, and they were unstoppable. Dr. Kieran sat in the Observer section during one particularly heated council session, watching as Counselor Vex struggled to explain how their military forces could stop an enemy they didn't understand. His confidence from 3 years ago had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "We need to find these humans." Dr. Chiron finally stood up and spoke, her voice cutting through the arguing. "They're the only ones who have fought this enemy before. They might be the only ones who know how to stop them." The council chamber fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. The same species they had dismissed as primitive phantoms might now be their only hope for survival. But Commander Jinho's transmission had gone silent long ago. No one knew if the humans were even still alive to help them.
Lieutenant Kane was halfway through his 3rd cup of synthetic coffee when every alarm on Outpost Delta 7 started.
Screaming at once, the small monitoring station, positioned on the edge of civilized space, barely saw anything more exciting than the occasional merchant vessel or lost tourist ship. But now his sensor screens were lighting up like a festival. "Celebration? What in the void is that?" he muttered, nearly spilling his coffee as he rushed to his console. The readings didn't make any sense. His instruments were detecting hundreds of massive objects appearing out of nowhere, materializing at the very edge of the system like ghosts becoming solid. Captain Thielen burst into the control room still, pulling on his uniform jacket. "Report, are we under attack?" Lieutenant Kane stared at his screens, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Sir, I'm detecting a massive fleet of unknown vessels. They just appeared out of hyperspace, but their energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases." The captain leaned over Kane's shoulder, studying the tactical display. What he saw made him question whether his equipment was malfunctioning. The ships were enormous, some of them easily the size of galactic dreadnoughts, but they looked nothing like the sleek, elegant vessels that civilized species built. These ships were brutal and ugly. They were covered in thick armor plating that looked like it had been welded on by hand, instead of the smooth, curved lines that most advanced species favored. These vessels were angular and aggressive, like weapons designed by someone who expected to be shot at constantly. "Look at those weapon systems," Lieutenant Kane whispered, zooming in on one of the larger vessels. "Those are kinetic weapons. Actual projectile launchers. Who still uses those ancient things?" Captain Thielen frowned as he studied the fleet. "Formation. Despite their primitive appearance, the ships were arranged in perfect military order. Someone with serious tactical knowledge was commanding this fleet, and they clearly knew what they were doing. The communication system suddenly crackled to life, and both officers jumped. A voice came through the speakers, speaking in perfect Galactic standard, but with an accent neither of them had ever heard before. Outpost Delta 7. This is Admiral Soman of the Human Expeditionary Force. We received your distress call regarding the Devourer attacks. We're here to help. Captain Thielen and Lieutenant Kane stared at each other in shock. Humans, the mythical species from the impossible death world that the Council had dismissed years ago. They were real, and they were here. Admiral Soman, Captain Thielen managed to say into his communicator, his voice cracking slightly, "This is Captain Thielen of Outpost Delta 7. We ... We weren't sure your species actually existed." The sound came through the speakers that might have been laughter. I get that a lot. Permission to approach your station. We'd like to coordinate our response to the Devourer threat. As the human fleet began moving toward the outpost, Lieutenant Kane couldn't stop staring at the tactical display. The ships moved with purpose and precision, their formation shifting smoothly as they approached. These weren't the desperate refugees he had expected from a dying world. These were professional military vessels with experienced crews. Captain Lieutenant Kane said quietly, "Look at their formation. They're not just random ships thrown together. This is an organized battle fleet. They came here ready for war." Captain Thielen nodded, watching as the human vessels took up defensive positions around the outpost without being asked. Their movements showed the kind of coordination that only came from extensive training and combat experience. "Admiral Soman," he said into the communicator, "how many ships do you have?" "This is just the advance force," came the reply. "We've got 300 vessels in this group, with more fleets en route." "Captain Thielen, we understand you've lost several worlds to the Devourers. We're here to make sure you don't lose any more." As the massive human ships settled into position around the tiny outpost, Captain Thielen realized that everything was about to change. The species that the galaxy had written off as impossible were not only real, but they had come prepared for the fight of their lives. The Grand Council chamber had never seen anything like Admiral Soman before. As she walked through the massive doors, her heavy boots echoed against the polished floor with a sound that seemed almost violent compared to the soft whispers and gentle movements of the assembled alien delegates. Her military armor bore the scars of countless battles, were scratches and dents that told stories of survival against impossible odds. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their floating chairs. They got their first close look at a human being. Admiral Soman was shorter than most of the alien species present, but there was something about the way she moved that made her seem dangerous. Her muscles were clearly visible even through her armor, and her eyes held a hardness that spoke of someone who had seen too much death. Counselor Vex, who had dismissed the human transmission years earlier, now found himself face to face with living proof that he had been wrong. He watched nervously as Admiral Soman approached the speaking platform. Her movements precise and controlled, like a predator sizing up potential threats. "Honorable council members," Admiral Soman began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation systems. "I am Admiral Soman of the Human Space Force. 3 years ago, Commander Ginho sent you a warning about the Devourers. You chose not to listen. Now 12 worlds are dead, and billions of your people have been consumed." The blunt statement sent ripples of discomfort through the assembly. These aliens were used to diplomatic language, careful phrases that avoided giving offense. Admiral Soman's directness was like a slap in the face. "You want to know about humans?" she continued. "Let me tell you about our world. Earth has gravity that would crush most of your bones within minutes. Our atmosphere contains gases that would burn your lungs. We have storms that can level entire cities, earthquakes that can split continents, and volcanoes that can change our planet's climate for years." As she spoke, a holographic display activated behind her, showing images of Earth that made several council members gasp in horror. Massive hurricanes swirling with deadly fury, tornadoes tearing through landscapes, tsunamis washing away everything in their path. We have predators that hunt in coordinated packs, Admiral Somin explained, showing images of wolves surrounding their prey. We have creatures that can crush a human skull with their jaws, others that inject venom that kills in seconds, and some that are so perfectly camouflaged that you never see death coming. Counselor Zeth, whose species had evolved on a peaceful garden world, covered her eyes. How do you survive in such a nightmare? Admiral Somin's expression softened slightly. Because it's not a nightmare to us, it's home. Every challenge on our world made us stronger, smarter, more adaptable. We learn to work together or die alone. We learn that sometimes the only way to survive is to fight. Lieutenant Jae-sung stepped forward, activating a new series of displays that showed human military tactics. The council watched in fascination and growing horror as he explained how humans had turned their world's harsh lessons into weapons of war. We learned pack hunting from wolves, he explained, showing footage of human ships coordinating attacks. We learned persistence from our ancestors who could outlast any prey. We learned sacrifice from parents who would die to protect their children. The displays showed human training exercises that looked brutal by galactic standards. Soldiers fighting in conditions that would kill most alien species, learning to operate with broken bones and severe injuries. Practicing tactics that required some units to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Our military doctrine is based on a simple principle, Admiral Somin said. No matter how bad things get, humans don't give up. We've faced extinction events before on our own world. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions. Each time, our species survived by adapting, by fighting, by refusing to surrender. The chamber fell completely silent as the implications sank in. These humans hadn't just survived on their hellish world, they had learned lessons that made them uniquely qualified to fight an enemy like the Devourers. The Devourers consume everything organic, Admiral Somin concluded. They're efficient, methodical, and they've never faced serious resistance. Until now. We know how to hurt them because we've been fighting for survival our entire evolutionary history. For the first time in galactic history, the Council realized they might have found warriors capable of saving them all. The warning alarms across. Zarian Prime had been screaming for 3 hours when the first Devourer ships appeared on the horizon. The planet's 42 million inhabitants watched in terror. From their emergency shelters as massive mechanical vessels descended through the atmosphere like a plague of metallic insects. These ships were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, their surfaces crawling with harvesting equipment designed to strip away every useful atom from a world high above the planet. Admiral Somin stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Use Resilience, watching the enemy swarm grow larger on her tactical displays. Around her, the ship's crew worked with calm efficiency that came from months of preparation. These weren't panicked civilians facing the unknown. These were human warriors who had trained their entire lives for moments like this. Admiral, we count over 800 Devourer vessels, reported Commander Unesio from her sensor station. They're beginning harvesting operations on the northern continent. Admiral Somin nodded grimly. The Devourers always followed the same pattern. They would land their harvesting ships on a planet's surface and begin consuming everything organic. While their military vessels provided protection from orbit, no galactic military force had ever been able to break through their defensive formations. But the humans weren't like any military force the galaxy had ever seen. All ships. This is Admiral Somin, she announced over the fleet communication system. Remember your training. We hit them fast, we hit them hard, and we don't give them time to adapt. Pack Formation Delta, execute on my mark. Across the human fleet. 300 warships began moving into attack positions with a coordination that amazed the watching galactic observers. Unlike the formal battle lines that civilized species used, the humans moved like a hunting pack, smaller ships darting ahead to probe enemy defenses, while the larger vessels prepared to strike at weak points. Captain Teho commanded the destroyer squadron at the front of the formation. His ships were the smallest and fastest in the fleet, designed for hit-and-run attacks that would confuse and divide enemy forces. As his squadron raced toward the Devourer swarm, he could hear his crew making final preparations behind him. "Captain, targeting systems are locked on the enemy command vessel," his weapons officer reported. "Negative," Captain Tejo replied calmly. "We're not shooting at it. We're going through it. All power to forward shields. Prepare for ramming speed." The bridge fell silent for a moment as the crew processed what their captain had just ordered. Ramming attacks were considered suicide missions by most galactic militaries, but humans had a different perspective on acceptable losses. The destroyer squadron accelerated to full speed, their engines pushing the ships far beyond safe operational limits. As they approached the Devourer formation, enemy vessels began firing defensive weapons. But the human ships were too small and fast to hit reliably. Captain Tejo's destroyer struck the lead. Devour a ship with the force of a guided missile. The impact tore through both vessels, but the human ship had been designed to survive such collisions. As emergency systems activated and damage control teams rushed to their stations, Captain Tejo was already ordering his next attack. Meanwhile, Admiral Soman was leading the main assault force directly into the heart of the enemy swarm. The Ooze resilience was built like a fortress that could fly, its armor thick enough to withstand tremendous punishment while its weapons tore holes in enemy formations. "All batteries, focus fire on their harvesting ships," Admiral Soman ordered. "Every one of those vessels we destroy saves millions of lives on the surface." The human attack broke every rule of civilized warfare. Instead of maintaining safe distances and exchanging long-range fire, they closed to point-blank range where their weapons could do maximum damage. When their ammunition ran low, they used their ships themselves as weapons, ramming enemy vessels. With devastating effect, the watching galactic observers couldn't believe what they were seeing. For the first time in recorded history, the Devourers were being pushed back. Their perfect formations were breaking apart under the relentless human assault, and their harvesting operations on the planet's surface were being disrupted. "Admiral, the enemy is retreating," Commander Unesio reported with barely contained excitement. "They're abandoning the planet and withdrawing to deep space." Admiral Soman smiled grimly as she watched the Devourer fleet flee. The humans had proven something that the galaxy had thought impossible. The unstoppable enemy could be stopped, but only by warriors who understood that sometimes victory required sacrifice. The news hit the galactic communication networks like a lightning bolt. For the first time in the war against the Devourers, someone had won. The impossible had happened at Zarian Prime, and suddenly every species in the galaxy was talking about the humans from the Deathworld, who had made the unstoppable enemy run away. On the peaceful world of Tethys, Professor Quinn was teaching her usual class on galactic history when her students began receiving emergency news updates on their personal devices. Within minutes, her classroom had transformed from a quiet academic setting into a buzzing hub of excitement and disbelief. "Professor, is it really true?" asked one of her students, a young Altarian whose species had never known warfare. "Did the humans actually defeat the Devourers?" Professor Quinn pulled up the news feeds on the classroom's main display, and they all watched in amazement as footage from the battle played out before them. But there was no denying their effectiveness. The Devourers, who had consumed dozens of worlds without losing a single battle, were actually retreating. But the victory at Zarian Prime was just the beginning. Within days of the battle, human reinforcement fleets began arriving from Earth, each one bringing new ships and fresh crews eager to join the fight. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing a dying world. These were professional warriors who had volunteered to travel across the galaxy to fight an enemy they had never seen. Commander Hejin arrived with the 3rd Reinforcement Fleet. Her ships carried weapons that had been specifically designed to fight the Devourers, based on data collected from the first battle. The humans hadn't just won once, they were already preparing to win again. "We studied their armor composition, Commander," Hyjin explained to a gathering of galactic military leaders. "We analyzed their energy signatures and their movement patterns. These new weapons are designed to exploit every weakness we discovered." The galactic observers were amazed by how quickly the humans adapted. To develop new military technology, going through endless committees and safety reviews, the humans had created entirely new weapon systems in the time it took most species to file the initial paperwork. But perhaps more importantly, the humans were sharing their knowledge with anyone willing to learn. Captain Dong Hyen established training academies on 17 different worlds, teaching alien military officers the brutal tactics that had proven effective against the Devers. The first lesson was always the hardest for the alien students. To accept, Captain Dong Hyen would stand before a classroom full of officers from species that had known peace for thousands of years and explain the concept of acceptable losses. In battle, some of your people will die, he would tell them bluntly. This is not a failure. This is the price of victory. The question you must ask yourself is not how to avoid all casualties, but how to make sure their sacrifice counts. The alien officers would shift uncomfortably in their seats, their translators struggling to convey concepts that their languages barely had words for. Most civilized species had evolved beyond the need for such harsh thinking. But the Devourers didn't care about their peaceful philosophies. Lieutenant Min Jun, who had survived 3 battles against the Devourers, taught pack coordination too. Alien pilots who had never flown in formation with anyone. Your instinct is to spread out and avoid danger, he explained. But that just makes you easy targets. Stay close to your wingmates. Sometimes the ship next to you is more important than your own safety. The transformation was remarkable to watch. Species that had been prey animals for millions of years were learning to think like predators. The gentle Etherians, whose entire culture was based on harmony and cooperation, began training their pilots in aggressive combat maneuvers. The scholarly Vorthok started manufacturing weapons for the first time in their recorded history on Earth. The response to news of the Galactic War was immediate and overwhelming. Recruitment centers across the planet were flooded with volunteers from every nation and every walk of life. Construction shipyards worked around the clock to build new vessels, while weapons factories converted their entire production lines to military purposes. Captain Sujin, veteran of the Zarian Prime Battle, returned to Earth to help coordinate the war effort. She found a world transformed by purpose. Everyone wants to help, she reported to Admiral Soman. We're not just fighting for our own survival anymore. We're fighting for an entire galaxy that never even knew we existed. The tide of the war was beginning to turn, and for the first time since the Devourers had appeared, the galaxy had hope. The prey species were learning to fight back, and their teachers were the warriors from the impossible Deathworld who refused to give up. The journey to the galactic void took 3 months, traveling through empty space so dark and cold that it felt like sailing through death itself. Admiral Soman stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring out at the absolute blackness ahead, knowing that somewhere in that emptiness lay the source of all the galaxy's nightmares. The combined human armada was the largest military force their species had ever assembled. Over 1,000 ships from Earth and her colonies, each one crewed by volunteers who understood they might never see home again. Behind them followed alien vessels from dozens of worlds, species that had learned to fight by watching the humans turn their planet's harsh lessons into weapons of war. Admiral, long-range sensors are picking up something, reported Commander Unesio, her voice tight with tension. It's massive, bigger than anything we've ever seen. The main display activated, showing what their sensors had detected at the edge of scanner range. It wasn't a planet or a space station. It was something that defied easy description, a mechanical construct so large that it had its own gravitational field. The thing was feeding, literally consuming the matter from a nearby star and converting it into more of itself. My God, whispered Captain Jun-ho from his position at the tactical station. Long has it been growing? Dr. Park, the fleet's chief scientist, ran calculations on her portable computer. Based on the star's current mass and typical stellar consumption rates, I'd estimate this construct has been active for at least 50,000 years, maybe longer. The Devourer homeworld, if it could be called that, was revealed as they drew closer. It was a sprawling mechanical nightmare that stretched across millions of kilometers, its surface covered with manufacturing facilities, weapon emplacements, and launch bays that could deploy countless attack fleets. This wasn't just a military base. It was a machine designed for one purpose: consuming entire galaxies. Admiral Soman activated the fleet-wide communication system, knowing that her words would be transmitted back to Earth and every allied world watching this final confrontation. All ships. This is Admiral Somin. What we're seeing is the source of everything that has threatened our galaxy. This machine has consumed countless civilizations across millions of years. Today we show it that humans don't get consumed. We do the consuming. Colonel Menesio led the first assault wave, her fighters darting ahead of the main fleet like wolves probing a wounded prey animal. The construct's defenses came alive as they approached, filling space with energy weapons and automated defense drones that moved with mechanical precision. The defensive fire is intensifying, Colonel Menesio reported over the CUM system as her squadron weaved through the deadly barrage. But their targeting systems are designed for conventional tactics. They're having trouble tracking our pack formations. The human attack strategy was unlike anything the construct had faced before. Instead of approaching and organized battle lines like civilized species, the human ships moved like hunting animals, with smaller groups harassing the defenses while the main force looked for weak points to exploit. Admiral Soman watched the tactical display as her captains executed maneuvers that would have horrified military academies across the galaxy. Ships deliberately flew into crossfire to draw enemy attention away from their packmates. Entire squadrons sacrificed themselves to create openings for the larger vessels to exploit. Admiral, we found a weak point in their manufacturing sector, reported Captain Tejo from his heavy cruiser. But we'll need to get through 3 layers of defensive screens to reach it. Then we go through them, Admiral Soman replied without hesitation. All ships, concentrate fire on Sector 7. Pack Formation Alpha. We're going hunting. The human fleet converged on the weak point like a predator closing in for the kill. They had learned this behavior from their ancestors who had hunted mammoths across frozen plains. From wolves who brought down prey 10 times their size through coordination and persistence. The construct's defenses adapted quickly, redirecting weapons and deploying new defensive systems. But the humans adapted faster. When their energy weapons proved ineffective, they switched to kinetic bombardment. When their fighters were overwhelmed, they used their capital ships as battering rams. This is Admiral Soman to all Earth forces, she announced as her flagship plunged directly into the construct's defensive fire. We came from a world that tried to kill us every day. We survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and predators that made nightmares look friendly. This machine thinks it can consume us like it consumed the others. It's about to learn why humans are the apex predators of a death world. The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment when the galaxy's greatest threat met the species that refused to be prey. The construct had consumed civilizations for eons, but it had never faced warriors who viewed extinction as just another challenge to overcome. As the UES resilience broke through the final defensive layer and began targeting the construct's core systems, Admiral Soman smiled grimly. This was how Deathworlders ended extinction threats. The same Grand Council chamber that had once dismissed humanity's warning now buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from across the galaxy took their seats. The elegant floating chairs and soft lighting remained the same, but everything else had changed. Where once there had been the comfortable arrogance of a peaceful civilization, now there was the hard-earned wisdom of survivors. Admiral Soman entered the chamber wearing a new uniform, one that bore the insignia of her recent promotion to Galactic Defense Coordinator. The title had been created specifically for her, recognizing that the galaxy needed someone who understood warfare in ways that peaceful species never could. As she walked to the speaking platform, her heavy boots echoed in the silence, a sound that now commanded respect rather than discomfort. The transformation wasn't just in the council chamber. Reports from across the galaxy told the same story. Species that had known only peace for thousands of years were building weapons. Worlds that had never seen a military academy were constructing training facilities. The gentle philosophers and artists who had led galactic civilization were quietly stepping aside for harder individuals who understood the harsh realities of survival. 6 months ago, Admiral Soman began. This council dismissed my people as impossible phantoms. Today you're asking us to remake your entire approach to galactic defense. The irony isn't lost on me, but I'm not here to settle old scores. Here, because the galaxy needs to learn what humans have always known. Sometimes peace is only possible through strength.
Captain Sangwoo
Stood beside a holographic display showing footage from human training facilities that had been established. On 17 different worlds, the images were shocking to species accustomed to gentle educational methods. Young aliens were learning to fight with the desperate intensity of creatures whose survival depended on victory. What you're seeing here used to be impossible, Captain, Sangwoo explained to the watching delegates. These are Etherian pilots learning attack formations. The Etherians were pacifists for over 10,000 years. Now they're flying combat missions that would terrify veteran human pilots. The footage showed remarkable transformations. The graceful Etherians, whose culture had been built around harmony and cooperation, were now executing aggressive combat maneuvers with deadly precision. Their movements were still beautiful to watch. But now that beauty carried the promise of violence for anyone who threatened their worlds. Professor Yuna, human behavioral specialist, had spent months studying how different alien species adapted to military training. Her research had revealed something fascinating about the nature of intelligence itself. Every species in this galaxy evolved from something, she explained to the assembled council. Your ancestors were prey animals, but they were also survivors. That survival instinct is still there, buried under thousands of years of peaceful civilization. We're not teaching you to be human. We're teaching you to remember what your ancestors knew about staying alive. The results spoke for themselves. The Valdorian merchant fleet had been converted into a mobile defense force. The scholarly Vorthok had developed new weapons. Technology that combined their intellectual abilities with human tactical doctrine. Even the plant-like Sylvanians had found ways to contribute, using their natural regenerative abilities to create living armor that could repair itself during battle. But perhaps the most significant change was in the council itself, the old leadership. Structure, based on diplomatic consensus and careful negotiation, had proven inadequate for military decision-making. New positions had been created for individuals who understood the realities of combat, and many of those positions were now filled by species that had learned human-style thinking. Counselor Vex would dismiss the original human transmission. Now found himself serving under Admiral Soman in the new defense hierarchy. The irony was not lost on him, but he had adapted to the changed reality with the pragmatism of a true survivor. The galaxy we knew is gone, Admiral Soman concluded. Her presentation. The Devourers showed us that our peaceful civilization existed only because we hadn't yet met something that wanted to destroy it. That's not a criticism of what you built here. It's a recognition that paradise is fragile, and sometimes it takes warriors to protect it. The vote was unanimous. Every species in the galaxy agreed to adopt the new military doctrine. To build the weapons and train the soldiers necessary to defend their worlds, they understood now that sometimes salvation didn't come from enlightened diplomacy or advanced technology, but from the savage determination of species that had learned to survive in hell itself. As the council session ended,
representatives
from dozens of worlds gathered around Admiral Soman, eager to discuss defense strategies and military cooperation. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and that lesson had been taught by the warriors from the impossible Deathworld who had refused to let extinction have the final word.